a spine-tingling, nerve-shattering podcast featuring all your favorite monsters. You won't believe your ears when you listen to Monster Kid Radio. Hear your host, Derek M. Cook, and his ever-rotating stable of guests discuss your favorite classics and sometimes not-so-classic monster movies. Subscribe to Monster Kid Radio through iTunes or Stitcher, or visit monsterkidradio.net before the next weekly episode of Monster Kid Radio. Go through the archives for interviews with Sara, Victoria Price, and Joel Hodgson. Listen to discussions about movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon, Island of Terror, and King Kong. And don't forget convention coverage from Monster Bash and the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival. Classic Monsters, Modern Talk, and the Head of Rondo Hatton. Only on Monster Kid Radio.
Do you like the Tales from the Crypt? Do you love the Tales from the Crypt? Even if you've never seen an episode, this podcast is for you. I'm Melissa, your ghostess with the mostest, and host of the Good Evening Kiddies podcast. Each week, I break down another great episode from the TV series The Tales from the Crypt. Audio clips are included, so even if you haven't watched that episode, you're good to go. There are also special guests, trivia, mini movie reviews, and much more. What are you waiting for? Check out the Good Evening Kiddies podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. That's the Good Evening Kiddies podcast. Check it out today.
Greetings, listeners. We're back once again to talk to you about the Cthulhu mythos, its books, its monsters, its unfortunate human casualties, its timeline in general, and even its tangential bits, like the Dreamlands, or things of a weird nature, or things that are Lovecraftian leaning. Weird fiction, science fiction, horror. Learn of terrible meetings in lonely places, of cyclopean ruins, and vast staircases that lead down to abysses of nighted secrets, of complex angles that lead through invisible walls to other regions of space and time, and of hideous explorations in remote and forbidden places, on other worlds, and in different time-space continua. From the creation of our galaxy to the death of the sun, this is an exploration of the Cthulhu mythos from the perspective of humans' concept of history. We are the people's guide to the Cthulhu mythos. You can find us at PGTTCM.com, PGTTCM.podbean.com, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos starts now.
The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Season 8.
Reading 809. Reading 84 through 89. This episode is brought to you by FoundItemClothing.com and BunnySlippers.com. Subscribe to us at PGTTCM all over social media. We are DV Spitzer and Sara most of the time, and you can subscribe to our podcast wherever you subscribe to podcasts. We recommend Podbean and Apple Podcasts. Check us out at PGTTCM.com and go to PGTTCM.threadless.com to pick up some cool merch. As I said, we're all over social media as PGTTCM, specifically Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And if YouTube's more of your thing, or you want to suggest us to someone who doesn't listen to podcasts, send them over to People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos on the YouTubes. Written and edited by Daniel Spitzer. Audio edited by Daniel Spitzer. Music by Kevin MacLeod. And the following pieces are used in this episode. The Chamber, Oppressive Gloom, The Sky of Our Ancestors. Help the show by sharing, rating, liking, or 5-star giving wherever you listen to, subscribe to, rate, or whatever podcasts. Support the show by hitting the Patreon button at the top of pgttcm.podbean.com. Donate what you want. We'll get you part of the scheme. Hey, it'll be cool. PGTTCM is part of the Dark Myths Collective. Learn more at pgttcm.com or darkmyths.org. A Dreamer's Tale is the 5th book by Irish fantasy writer Lord Dunsany, considered a major influence on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, H.P. Lovecraft, Ursula K. Guin, and a whole bunch of other people. It was first published in hardcover by George Allen and Sons in September 1910. The following stories are collected in this week's recordings. Preface: Poltarnees, Beholder of Ocean; Blagdaross, The Madness of Andelsprutz, Where the Tides Ebb and Flow; Bethmoora, Idle Days on the Yann; The Sword and the Idle City; The Hashish Man; Poor Old Bill; The Beggars; Carcassonne; In Zakkarath; The Field; The Day of the Pole; The Unhappy Body. Read by David Mack. Let's get started. People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos begins now.
The Sword and the Idol. It was a cold winter's evening, late in the Stone Age. The sun had gone down blazing over the plains of Thold. There were no clouds, only the chill blue sky and the imminence of stars. And the surface of the sleeping earth began to harden against the cold of the night. Presently from their lairs arose and shook themselves and went stealthily forth those of earth's children to whom it is the law to prowl abroad as soon as the dusk has fallen. And they went pattering softly over the plain, and their eyes shone in the dark, and crossed and recrossed one another in their courses. Suddenly there became manifest in the midst of the plain that fearful portent of the presence of man, a little flickering fire. And the children of earth who prowl abroad by night looked sideways at it, and snarled, and edged away, all but the wolves, who came a little nearer, for it was winter and the wolves were hungry, and they had come in thousands from the mountains, and they said in their hearts, "We are strong." Around the fire a little tribe was encamped. They too had come from the mountains, and from lands beyond them, but it was in the mountains that the wolves first winded them. They picked up bones at first that the tribe had dropped, but they were closer now, and on all sides. It was Laws who had lit the fire. He had killed a small furry beast, hurling his stone axe at it, and had gathered a quantity of reddish-brown stones, and had laid them in a long row, and placed bits of the small beast all along it. Then he lit a fire on each side, and the stones heated, and the bits began to cook. It was at this time that the tribe noticed that the wolves who had followed them so far were no longer content with the scraps of deserted encampments. A line of yellow eyes surrounded them, and when it moved, it was to come nearer. So the men of the tribe hastily tore up brushwood, and felled a small tree with their flint axes, and heaped it all over the fire that Laws had made, and for a while the great heap hid the flame, and the wolves came trotting in and sat down again on their haunches, much closer than before. And the fierce and valiant dogs that belonged to the tribe believed that their end was about to come while fighting, as they had long since prophesied it would. Then the flame caught the lofty stack of brushwood, and rushed out of it, and ran up the side of it, and stood up haughtily far over the top. And the wolves, seeing this terrible ally of man reveling there in his strength, and knowing nothing of his frequent treachery to his masters, went slowly away as though they had other purposes. And for the rest of that night the dogs of the encampment cried out to them and besought them to come back. But the tribe lay down all around the fire under thick firs and slept. And a great wind arose and blew into the roaring heart of the fire till it was red no longer, but all pallid with heat. With the dawn the tribe awoke. Laws might have known that after such a mighty conflagration nothing could remain of his small furry beast, but there was hunger in him and little reason as he searched among the ashes. What he found there amazed him beyond.
We'd like to thank you for listening to People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Our sponsor is BunnySlippers.com, your finest source of wonderful Cthulhu slippers and cool shirts from FoundItemClothing.com, your favorite shirts from your favorite cult films, and also these fine folks.
Measure. There was no meat, There was not even his row of reddish-brown stones, but something longer than a man's leg and narrower than his hand was lying there like a great flattened snake. When Laws looked at its thin edges and saw that it ran to a point, he picked up stones to chip it and make it sharp. It was the instinct of Laws to sharpen things. When he found that it could not be chipped, his wonderment increased. It was many hours before he discovered that he could sharpen the edges by rubbing them with a stone. But at last the point was sharp, and all one side of it except near the end, where Laws held it in his hand. And Laws lifted it and brandished it, and the Stone Age was over. That afternoon, in the little encampment, just as the tribe moved on, the Stone Age passed away, which, for perhaps 30 or 40,000 years, had slowly lifted man from among the beasts and left him with his supremacy beyond all hope of reconquest. It was not for many days that any other man tried to make for himself an iron sword by cooking the same kind of small furry beast that Laws had tried to cook. It was not for many years that any thought to lay the meat along stones as Laws had done, and when they did, being no longer on the plains of Fold, they used flints or chalk. It was not for many generations that another piece of iron ore was melted, and the secret slowly guessed. Nevertheless, one of Earth's many veils was torn aside by Laws to give us ultimately the steel sword and the plow, machinery, and factories. Let us not blame Laws if we think that he did wrong, for he did all in ignorance. The tribe moved on until it came to water, and there it settled down under a hill, and they built their huts there. Very soon they had to fight with another tribe, a tribe that was stronger than they. But the sword of Laws was terrible, and his tribe slew their foes. You might make one blow at Laws, but then would come one thrust from that iron sword, and there was no way of surviving it. No one could fight with Laws, and he became ruler of the tribe in the place of Iz, who hitherto had ruled it with his sharp axe, as his father had before him. Now Laws begat Lo, and in his old age gave his sword to him, and Lo ruled the tribe with it. And Lo called the name of the sword Death, because it was so swift and terrible. And Iz begat Erd, who was of no account. And Erd hated Lo, because he was of no account, by reason of the iron sword of Lo. One night Erd stole down to the hut of Lo, carrying his sharp axe, and he went very softly. But Lo's dog, Warner, heard him coming, and he growled softly by his master's door. When Erd came to the hut, he heard Lo talking gently to his sword, and Lo was saying, "Lie still, Death. Rest, rest, old sword." And then, "What, again, Death? Be still, be still." And then again, "What, art thou hungry, Death, or thirsty, poor old sword? Soon, Death, soon. Be still only a little." But Erd fled, for he did not like the gentle tone of Lo as he spoke to his sword. And Lo begat Lod, and when Lo died, Lod took the iron sword and ruled the tribe. And Erd begat Ith, who was of no account like his father. Now when Lod had smitten a man or killed a terrible beast, Ith would go away for a while into the forest, rather than hear the praises that would be given to Lod. And once, as Ith sat in the forest waiting for the day to pass, he suddenly thought he saw a tree trunk looking at him as with a face, and Ith was afraid, for trees should not look at men. But soon Ith saw that it was only a tree, and not a man, though it was like a man. Ith used to speak to this tree and tell it about Lod, for he dared not speak to anyone else about him, and Ith found comfort in speaking about Lod. One day Ith went with his stone axe into the forest and stayed there many days. He came back by night, and the next morning when the tribe awoke, they saw something that was like a man and yet was not a man, and it sat on the hill with its elbows pointing outwards and was quite still. And Ith was crouching before it, and hurriedly placing before it fruits and flesh, and then leaping away from it and looking frightened. Presently all the tribe came out to see, but dared not come quite close because of the fear that they saw in the face of Ith. And Ith went to his hut and came back again with a hunting spearhead and valuable small stone knives, and reached out and laid them before the thing that was like a man, and then sprang away from it. And some of the tribe questioned Ith about the still thing that was like a man, and Ith said, "This is Ged." Then they asked, "Who is Ged?" And Ith said, "Ged sends the crops and the rain, and the sun and the moon are Ged's." Then the tribe went back to their huts, but later in the day some came again, and they said to Ith, "Ged is only as we are, having hands and feet." And Ith pointed to the right hand of Ged, which was not as his left, but was shaped like the paw of a beast. And Ith said, "By this ye may know that he is not as any man." Then they said, "He is indeed Ged." But Lod said, "He speaketh not, nor doth he eat." And Ith answered, "The thunder is his voice, and the famine is his eating." After this the tribe copied Ith, and brought little gifts of meat to Ged, and Ith cooked them before him that Ged might smell the cooking. One day a great thunderstorm came trampling up from the distance and raged among the hills, and the tribe all hid away from it in their huts. And Ith appeared among the huts, looking unafraid, and Ith said little, but the tribe thought that he had expected the terrible storm, because the meat that they had laid before Ged had been tough meat, and not the best parts of the beasts they slew. And Ged grew to have more honor among the tribe than Lod, and Lod was vexed. One night Lod arose when all were asleep, and quieted his dog, and took his iron sword, and went away to the hill. And he came on Ged in the starlight, sitting still, with his elbows pointing outwards, and his beast's paw, and the mark of the fire on the ground where his food had been cooked. And Lod stood there for a while in great fear, trying to keep to his purpose. Suddenly he stepped up close to Ged and lifted his iron sword, and Ged neither hit nor shrank. Then the thought came into Lod's mind, "Ged does not hit. What will Ged do instead?" And Lod lowered his sword and struck not, and his imagination began to work on that "What will Ged do instead?" And the more Lod thought, the worse was his fear of Ged, and Lod ran away and left him. Lod still ruled the tribe in battle or in the hunt, but the chiefest spoils of battle were given to Ged, and the beasts that they slew were Ged's, and all questions that concerned war or peace, and questions of law and disputes, were always brought to him, and Ith gave the answers after speaking to Ged by night. At last Ith said, the day after an eclipse, that the gifts which they brought to Ged were not enough, that some far greater sacrifice was needed, that Ged was very angry even now, and not to be appeased by any ordinary sacrifice. And Ith said that to save the tribe from the anger of Ged, he would speak to Ged that night and ask him what new sacrifice he needed. Deep in his heart Lod shuddered, for his instinct told him that Ged wanted Lod's only son, who should hold the iron sword when Lod was gone. No one would dare touch Lod because of the iron sword, but his instinct said in his slow mind again and again, "Ged loves Ith. Ith has said so. Ith hates the sword holders. Ith hates the sword holders. Ged loves Ith." Evening fell, and the night came when Ith should speak with Ged, and Lod became ever surer of the doom of his race. He lay down, but could not sleep. Midnight had barely come when Lod arose and went with his iron sword again to the hill. And there sat Ged. Had Ith been to him yet? Ith, whom Ged loved, who hated the sword holders. And Lod looked long at the old sword of iron that had come to his grandfather on the plains of Thold. "Goodbye, old sword." And Lod laid it on the knees of Ged, then went away. And when Ith came, a little before dawn, the sacrifice was found acceptable unto Ged. The Idle City. There was once a city which was an idle city, wherein men told vain tales. And it was that city's custom to tax all men that would enter in with a toll of some idle story in the gate. So all men paid to the watchers in the gate the toll of an idle story, and passed into the city unhindered and unhurt. And in a certain hour of the night, when the king of that city arose and went pacing swiftly up and down the chamber of his sleeping, and called upon the name of the dead queen, then would the watchers fasten up the gate, and go into that chamber to the king, and, sitting on the floor, would tell him all the tales that they had gathered. And listening to them, some calmer mood would come upon the king, and listening still he would lie down again, and at last fall asleep. And all the watchers silently would arise and steal away from the chamber. A while ago wandering, I came to the gate of that city, and even as I came, a man stood up to pay his toll to the watchers. They were seated cross-legged on the ground between him and the gate, and each one held a spear. Near him 2 other travelers sat on the warm sand waiting, and the man said, "Now the city of Nambros forsook the worship of the gods and turned towards God. So the gods threw their cloaks over their faces and strode away from the city, and going into the haze among the hills passed through the trunks of the olive groves into the sunset. But when they had already left the earth, they turned and looked through the gleaming folds of the twilight for the last time at their city, and they looked half in anger and half in regret, then turned and went away forever. But they sent back a death who bore a scythe, saying to it, 'Slay half in the city that forsook us, but half of them spare alive, that they may yet remember their old forsaken gods.' But God sent a destroying angel to show that he was God, saying unto him, 'Go into that city and slay half of the dwellers therein, yet spare a half of them, that they may know that I am God.' And at once the destroying angel put his hand to his sword, and the sword came out of the scabbard with a deep breath, like to the breath that a broad woodman takes before his first blow at some giant oak. Thereat the angel pointed his arm downwards, and bending his head between them, fell forward from heaven's edge, and the spring of his ankles shot him downwards with his wings furled behind him. So he went slanting earthward through the evening with his sword stretched out before him, and he was like a javelin that some hunter hath hurled that returneth again to the earth. But just before he touched it, he lifted his head and spread his wings with the under feathers forward, and alighted by the bank of the broad Flavro that divides the city of Nambros. And down the bank of the Flavro he fluttered low like to a hawk over a new-cut cornfield, when the little creatures of the corn are shelterless. And at the same time down the other bank the death from the gods went mowing. At once they saw each other, and the angel glared at the death, and the death leered back at him, and the flames in the eyes of the angel illumined with a red glare the mist that lay in the hollows of the sockets of the death. Suddenly they fell on one another, sword to scythe, and the angel captured the temples of the gods, and set up over them the sign of God, and the death captured the temples of God, and led into them the ceremonies and sacrifices of the gods. And all the while the centuries slipped quietly by, going down the Flavro seawards. And now some worship God in the temple of the gods, and others worship the gods in the temple of God. And still the angel hath not returned again to the rejoicing choirs, and still the death hath not gone back to die with the dead gods. But all through Nambros they fight up and down, and still on each side of the Flavro the city lives. And the watchers in the gate said, 'Enter in.' Then another traveler rose up and said, "Solemnly between Huinwazi and Nikrana, the huge great clouds came floating, and those great mountains, heavenly Huinwazi and Nikrana, the king of peaks, greeted them, calling them brothers. And the clouds were glad of their greeting, for they meet with companions seldom in the lonely heights of the sky. But the vapors of evening said unto the earth mist, What are those shapes that dare to move above us and go to where Nikrana is and Huinwazi? And the earth mist said in answer to the vapors of evening, It is only an earth mist that has become mad, and has left the warm and comfortable earth, and has in his madness thought that his place is with Huinwazi and Nikrana. Once, said the vapors of evening, there were clouds, but this was many and many a day ago, as our forefathers have said. Perhaps the mad one thinks he is the clouds. Then spake the earthworms from the warm deeps of the mud, saying, O earth mist, thou art indeed the clouds, and there are no clouds but thou. And as for Huinwazi and Nikrana, I cannot see them, and therefore they are not high, and there are no mountains in the world but those that I cast up every morning out of the deeps of the mud. And the earth mist and the vapors of evening were glad at the voice of the earthworms, and looking earthward believed what they had said. And indeed it is better to be as the earth mist, and to keep close to the warm mud at night, and to hear the earthworm's comfortable speech, and not to be a wanderer in the cheerless heights, but to leave the mountains alone with their desolate snow, to draw what comfort they can from their vast aspect over all the cities of men, and from the whispers that they hear at evening of unknown distant gods. And the watchers in the gate said, Enter in. Then a man stood up who came out of the west, and told a western tale. He said, There is a road in Rome that runs through an ancient temple that once the gods had loved. It runs along the top of a great wall, and the floor of the temple lies far down beneath it, of marble, pink and white. Upon the temple floor I counted to the number of 13 hungry cats. Sometimes, they said among themselves, it was the gods that lived here. Sometimes it was men, and now it's cats. So let us enjoy the sun on the hot marble before another people comes. For it was at that hour of a warm afternoon when my fancy is able to hear silent voices. And the awful leanness of all those 13 cats moved me to go into a neighboring fish shop, and there to buy a quantity of fishes. Then I returned and threw them all over the railing at the top of the great wall, and they fell for 30 feet and hit the sacred marble with a smack. Now in any other town but Rome, or in the minds of any other cats, the sight of fishes falling out of heaven had surely excited wonder. They rose slowly and all stretched themselves. Then they came leisurely toward the fishes. It is only a miracle, they said in their hearts. And the watchers in the gate said, Enter in. Proudly and slowly, as they spoke, drew up to them a camel, whose rider sought entrance to the city. His face shone with the sunset by which for long he had steered for the city's gate. Of him they demanded toll, whereat he spoke to his camel, and the camel roared and kneeled, and the man descended from him. And the man unwrapped from many silks a box of divers metals wrought by the Japanese, and on the lid of it were figures of men who gazed from some shore at an isle of the inland sea. This he showed to the watchers, and when they had seen it, said, It has seemed to me that these speak to each other thus. Behold now Oojni, the dear one of the sea, the little mother sea that hath no storms. She goeth out from Oojni singing a song, and she returneth singing over her sands. Little is Oojni in the lap of the sea, and scarce to be perceived by wandering ships. White sails have never wafted her legends afar. They are told not by bearded wanderers of the sea. Her fireside tales are known not to the north. The dragons of China have not heard of them, nor those that ride on elephants through Ind. Men tell the tales, and the smoke arises upwards. The smoke departeth, and the tales are told. Aojni is not a name among the nations. She is not known of where the merchants meet. She is not spoken of by alien lips. Indeed, but Aojni is little among the isles, yet is she loved by those that know her coasts and her inland places hidden from the sea. Without glory, without fame, and without wealth, Aojni is greatly loved by a little people, and by a few. Yet not by a few, for all her dead still love her, and oft by night come whispering through her woods. Who could forget Aojni, even among the dead? For here in Aojni, wot you, are homes of men, and gardens, and golden temples of the gods, and sacred places inshore from the sea, and many murmurous woods. And there is a path that winds over the hills to go into mysterious holy lands, where dance by night the spirits of the woods, or sing unseen in the sunlight. And no one goes into these holy lands, for who that love Aojni could rob her of her mysteries? And the curious aliens come not. Indeed, but we love Aojni, though she is so little. She is the little mother of our race, and the kindly nurse of all seafaring birds. And behold, even now caressing her, the gentle fingers of the mother sea, whose dreams are far with that old wanderer, Ocean. And yet let us not forget Fusiyama, for he stands manifest over clouds and sea, misty below, and vague and indistinct, but clear above for all the isles to watch. The ships make all their journeys in his sight. The nights and the days go by him like a wind. The summers and winters under him flicker and fade. The lives of men pass quietly here and hence, and Fusiyama watches there and knows. And the watchers in the gate said, "Enter in." And I too would have told them a tale, very wonderful and very true, one that I had told in many cities, which as yet had no believers. But now the sun had set, and the brief twilight gone, and ghostly silences were rising from far and darkening hills. A stillness hung over that city's gate, and the great silence of the solemn night was more acceptable to the watchers in the gate than any sound of man. Therefore they beckoned to us, and motioned with their hands that we should pass untaxed into the city. And softly we went up over the sand, and between the high rock pillars of the gate, and a deep stillness settled among the watchers, and the stars over them twinkled undisturbed. For how short a while man speaks, and withal how vainly, and for how long he is silent. Only the other day I met a king in Thebes who had been silent already for 4,000 years. The Hashish Man. I was at a dinner in London the other day. The ladies had gone upstairs, and no one sat on my right. On my left there was a man I did not know, but he knew my name somehow apparently, for he turned to me after a while and said, "I read a story of yours about Bethmoora in a review." Of course I remembered the tale. It was about a beautiful oriental city that was suddenly deserted in a day. Nobody quite knew why. I said, "Oh yes," and slowly searched in my mind for some more fitting acknowledgment of the compliment that his memory had paid me. I was greatly astonished when he said, "You were wrong about the Nausar sickness. It was not that at all." I said, "Why, have you been there?" And he said, "Yes, I do it with Hashish. I know Bethmoora well." And he took out of his pocket a small box full of some black stuff that looked like tar but had a stranger smell. He warned me not to touch it with my finger, as the stain remained for days. "I got it from a gypsy," he said. He had a lot of it, as it had killed his father. But I interrupted him, for I wanted to know for certain what it was that had made desolate that beautiful city, Bethmoora, and why they fled from it swiftly in a day. Was it because of the desert's curse, I asked? And he said, "Partly it was the fury of the desert, and partly the advice of the emperor, Thubamlin, for that fearful beast is in some way connected with the desert on his mother's side." and he told me this strange story. You remember the sailor with the black scar who was there on the day that you described when the messengers came on mules to the gate of Bethmoora and all the people fled? I met this man in a tavern drinking rum, and he told me all about the flight from Bethmoora, but knew no more than you did what the message was or who had sent it. However, he said he would see Bethmoora once more whenever he touched again at an eastern port, even if he had to face the devil. He often said that he would face the devil to find out the mystery of that message that had emptied Bethmoora in a day. And in the end he had to face Thubamleen, whose weak ferocity he had not imagined. For one day the sailor told me he had found a ship, and I met him no more after that in the tavern drinking rum. It was about that time that I got the hashish from the gypsy, who had a quantity that he did not want. It takes one literally out of oneself. It is like wings. You swoop over distant countries and into other worlds. Once I found out the secret of the universe. I have forgotten what it was, but I know that the Creator does not take creation seriously, for I remember that he sat in space with all his work in front of him and laughed. I have seen incredible things in fearful worlds. As it is your imagination that takes you there, so it is only by your imagination that you can get back. Once, out in the ether, I met a battered, prowling spirit that had belonged to a man whom drugs had killed 100 years ago, and he led me to regions that I had never imagined, and we parted in anger beyond the Pleiades, and I could not imagine my way back. And I met a huge gray shape that was the spirit of some great people, perhaps of a whole star, and I besought it to show me my way home, and it halted beside me like a sudden wind and pointed, and, speaking quite softly, asked me if I discerned a certain tiny light, and I saw a far star faintly, and then it said to me, "That is the solar system," and strode tremendously on. And somehow I imagined my way back, and only just in time, for my body was already stiffening in a chair in my room, and the fire had gone out and everything was cold, and I had to move each finger one by one, and there were pins and needles in them, and dreadful pains in the nails, which began to thaw. And at last I could move one arm, and reached a bell, and for a long time no one came, because everyone was in bed. But at last a man appeared, and they got a doctor, and he said that it was hashish poisoning, but it would have been all right if I hadn't met that battered, prowling spirit. I could tell you astounding things that I have seen, but you want to know who sent that message to Bethmoora. Well, it was Thubamleen, and this is how I know. I often went to the city after that day you wrote of. I used to take hashish of an evening in my flat, and I always found it uninhabited. Sand had poured into it from the desert, and the streets were yellow and smooth, and through open swinging doors the sand had drifted. One evening I had put the guard in front of the fire, and settled into a chair and eaten my hashish. And the first thing that I saw when I came to Bethmoora was a sailor with the black scar, strolling down the street and making footprints in the yellow sand. And now I knew that I should see what secret power it was that kept Bethmoora uninhabited. I saw that there was anger in the desert, for there were storm clouds heaving along the skyline, and I heard a muttering amongst the sand. The sailor strolled down the street, looking into the empty houses as he went. Sometimes he shouted, and sometimes he sang, and sometimes he wrote his name on a marble wall. Then he sat down on a step and ate his dinner. After a while he grew tired of the city and came back up the street. As he reached the gate of green copper, 3 men on camels appeared. I could do nothing. I was only a consciousness, invisible, wandering. My body was in Europe. The sailor fought well with his fists, but he was overpowered and bound with ropes and led away through the desert. I followed for as long as I could stay, and found that they were going by way of the desert round the hills of Hap towards Untnarvahi, and then I knew the camel men belonged to Thubamleen. I work in an insurance office all day, and I hope you won't forget me if you ever want to insure, life, fire, or motor, but that's no part of my story. I was desperately anxious to get back to my flat, though it is not good to take hashish 2 days running. But I wanted to see what they would do to the poor fellow, for I had heard bad rumors about Thubamleen. When at last I got away, I had a letter to write. Then I rang for my servant and told him I must not be disturbed, though I left my door unlocked in case of accidents. After that I made up a good fire and sat down and partook of the pot of dreams. I was going to the palace of Thubamleen. I was kept back longer than usual by noises in the street, but suddenly I was up above the town. The European countries rushed by beneath me, and there appeared the thin white palace spires of horrible Thubamleen. I found him presently at the end of a little narrow room. A curtain of red leather hung behind him, on which all the names of God, written in Yannish, were worked with a golden thread. 3 windows were small and high. The emperor seemed no more than about 20, and looked small and weak. No smiles came on his nasty yellow face, though he tittered continually. As I looked from his low forehead to his quivering under lip, I became aware that there was some horror about him, though I was not able to perceive what it was. And then I saw it. The man never blinked, and though later on I watched those eyes for a blink, it never happened once. And then I followed the emperor's rapt glance, and I saw the sailor lying on the floor, alive but hideously rent, and the royal torturers were at work all round him. They had torn long strips from him, but had not detached them, and they were torturing the ends of them far away from the sailor. The man that I met at dinner told me many things which I must omit. The sailor was groaning softly, and every time he groaned, Thubamleen tittered. I had no sense of smell, but I could hear and see, and I do not know which was the most revolting, the terrible condition of the sailor or the happy, unblinking face of horrible Thubamleen. I wanted to go away, but the time was not yet come, and I had to stay where I was. Suddenly the emperor's face began to twitch violently, and his under lip quivered faster, and he whimpered with anger, and cried with a shrill voice in Yannish to the captain of his torturers that there was a spirit in the room. I feared not, for living men cannot lay hands on a spirit, but all the torturers were appalled at his anger, and stopped their work, for their hands trembled in fear. Then 2 men of the spear guard slipped from the room, and each of them brought back presently a golden bowl with knobs on it, full of hashish, and the bowls were large enough for heads to have floated in had they been filled with blood. And the 2 men fell to rapidly, each eating with 2 great spoons. There was enough in each spoonful to have given dreams to 100 men. And there came upon them soon the hashish state, and their spirits hovered, preparing to go free, while I feared horribly, but ever and anon they fell back again to their bodies, recalled by some noise in the room. Still the men ate, but lazily now, and without ferocity. At last the great spoons dropped out of their hands, and their spirits rose and left them. I could not flee, and the spirits were more horrible than the men, because they were young men and not yet wholly molded to fit their fearful souls. Still the sailor groaned softly, evoking little titters from the emperor Thubamleen. Then the 2 spirits rushed at me, and swept me thence as gusts of wind sweep butterflies, and away we went from that small, pale, heinous man. There was no escaping from these spirits' fierce insistence. The energy in my minute lump of the drug was overwhelmed by the huge spoonsful that these men had eaten with both hands. I was whirled over Arvel Woundery and brought to the lands of Snith, and swept on still until I came to Kragua, and beyond this to those bleak lands that are nearly unknown to fancy. And we came at last to those ivory hills that are named the Mountains of Madness, and I tried to struggle against the spirits of that frightful emperor's men, for I heard on the other side of the ivory hills the pittering of those beasts that prey on the mad as they prowled up and down. It was no fault of mine that my little lump of hashish could not fight with their horrible spoonsful. Someone was tugging at the hall door bell. Presently a servant came and told our host that a policeman in the hall wished to speak to him at once. He apologized to us and went outside, and we heard a man in heavy boots who spoke in a low voice to him. My friend got up and walked over to the window and opened it and looked outside. "I should think it will be a fine night," he said. Then he jumped out. When we put our astonished heads out of the window to look for him, he was already out of sight.